I want to talk about how the animal sacrifice shows us the seriousness of sin, but also it shows us Christ's sacrifice. If you look at Abraham, he entered a blood sacrifice covenant, a blood covenant. When he passed between the pieces, well, he didn't pass, he had cut the animals into pieces, and God passed in between them through the fiery furnace, which relates to God being a consuming fire. It says in Genesis 15, verse 9, it says, "So he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." Which you see those later on in sacrifices. The poor were offered turtle doves or pigeons if they couldn't afford anything else. And you see the goats and the rams and then of course the red heifer sacrifice. Heifer being a female that has never had a child, and a red heifer, the red probably represents the blood. But I could be wrong about that, but that would be my guess, is the crimson. But it's a heifer is a female that didn't have has never had a baby. That's a heifer. So, but anyway, he says to bring him all these things. And verse 10, then he brought all these things to him and cut them in two, and laid each half opposite the other. But he did not cut the birds. The birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abraham drove them away. Not Adam. Abraham drove them away. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Adam, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in the land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will also judge the nation, And then verse 17 it says, and it came about when the sun had set that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between the pieces. Notice it was very dark. The sun had set and dark. Well, where do you see that again? You see that when Israel is in Egypt and they have light and the others do not. But also what was over the top of the tabernacle during the night? A pillar of fire, which I think it connects to this. All these things start to connect together. Flaming torch which passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, to the river of Egypt, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, which is in modern day Iraq. But this is how a blood covenant was made. Was passing through the pieces, and only God passed through the pieces. But a blood covenant is a very serious covenant, and when you look at the sacrificial system, you see that over and over and over again. But instead of the person dying for breaking the covenant, breaking their vows, breaking the covenant, an animal was allowed to be substituted to take the place in that blood covenant because of our sin, which is a shadow of Christ. The animal sacrifice was a shadow of what was really there was Christ. That's why it's important to study the shadow, so that we will gain an understanding of the eternal, the essence of what something is. Just like it talks about in Hebrews, about these are types and shadows of things to come. Just like the holy days are such. Blood of the sacrifices, the sacrifice of an animal allowed a substitutionary sacrifice. So you can't say, the law was done away with. No, it was a shadow of Christ. It wasn't done away with. It's a shadow of what Christ did. As the husband, he becomes our covering, which maybe even makes head covering more interesting for women, that represent realizing Christ, their husband and Christ are their covering. And that's what, in a sense, what the head covering represents to some degree. And it also separates the holy from the profane. If you go read what happened with the Nephilim, where it says the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair and basically had relations with them, and that's where the Nephilim came from. But this is all related. It's just like, what is another thing that they did in the wilderness? They had bread, and like you read in Exodus 16 about boil what you, and this was a command. This was to teach them obedience, to teach them about the Sabbath. Verse 22 of Exodus 16. Now on the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, then he said to them, "This is what the Lord meant. Tomorrow is the Sabbath observance, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over put aside. And this is the only day that it stayed good." The only day. And that's where we get prepping for Shabbat. But you read further back that if they tried to gather too much, it spoiled. It rotted overnight. So the wilderness shows us that we have the Word of God day by day in the manna, and we are to follow the light, that we are to follow Yahweh, pillar of cloud. When He moves, we move. When His Spirit moves, we need to be moving. When He says go, we go. When He says stay, we stay. When He says do this, we do it. And don't get into arguments about whether this is, how to do all this stuff, because that's where you run into trouble. It's like, do the best you can, instead of arguing about who's right and who's wrong. And another thing that was in the wilderness, and I know I'm combining a couple of different things, but they are related because it's all part of their journey in the wilderness. Just like our life is a journey in the wilderness. it says in Exodus 17 about the water and the rock, and the rock at Horeb, and they've actually found that rock that Moses hit, but where he hit the rock representing Christ, and water gushed out. And he said, I am the living. Christ said he was the living water. Well, same thing here. Without water, you cannot live. And it says, when Christ was tempted, he said, men cannot live on bread alone. When he was tempted by Satan, he says, men cannot live on bread alone, but every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. He was probably connecting those two, that the manna and the Word of God kind of become synonymous, or show the way it is, the way we should be, that we should be following Him day by day, seeking for His provision. And I think this is really important, just to realize our wilderness experiences is to teach us faith, to teach us obedience. Faith comes by hearing and obeying. Obedience. And faith. What is faith? Trust. We learn to trust. We learn when we obey the things in the Torah and see the blessings from them, like I did with Ziziot of Numbers 15, 38, and 39. All the other things, it's like, yes, Lord, no, whatever you would have me to do, yes, Yah. If you want me to grow a beard, yes, I will do that. If you want me to do this, I will do that. And that's what we do. We don't hesitate. We just go and do what He says to do. And that's what the wilderness is, the transforming place. Just like Moses came out of Egypt and was a shepherd for like 40 years before he went back to shepherd the people. And there's so many parallels between Moses and Christ, where Moses had to be put down the river to be saved because they were killing all the male children in Israel. I mean, in Egypt. And Yeshua and his family had to flee because Herod sought his life, and leading us out of the world and through the wilderness. Christ does the same thing. He is our Passover and protects us in the time of judgment. Just as they were protected in Egypt on Passover with the blood of the Lamb, so are we when the judgment rolls around of the consuming fire returning. Shalom, shalom.